So this is starting to become much more complex than the way we traditionally simulate neural networks. Now, when we look at these neurotransmitters when they operate on the dendrites, they can do a number of different things. They can excite or inhibit the neuron for just an instantaneous amount of time or a lengthy amount of time. And sometimes the neurotransmitters can cause the nucleus here to release instructions and start producing new proteins, and then the neuron changes itself. So if we want to simulate neurons to try and recreate sentience or recreate the brain, we might have to simulate all of these factors, including the DNA of the nucleus of every neuron. And because these nonlinear effects could be important for how the brain works. Now, the idea that you can take 100 billion neurons with a quadrillion connections, which is about how big the brain is, and pull it together and generate sentient behavior is called connectionism or connectoplasm. It emphasizes the plasticity of the brain. And this is McClellan and Rumelhart, who are famous psychologists who developed connectionism or parallel distributed processing, and Ray Kurzweil is also into this idea of connectoplasm. But you can't just have an unstructured collection of neurons and expect something to happen. So it's always a question of how much structure do you add to the system. So at the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the idea that the mind's innately structured. And we know it's innately structured if you look at the biology of the brain. You find brain regions which do particular things, and when they fail, there's particular pathologies which are presented. And at the very far end of the spectrum is the Swiss Army knife theory of the mind, which is that the mind has an information processing system for pretty much every single activity that it engages in. So which approach should we use to make a reductionist explanation? Well, if you try and simulate neurons, it's like trying to run PowerPC code on an x86 chip. But it's much worse than that, because PowerPC code was designed to work on silicon in the first place. And we're trying to emulate a complex electrochemical system. If the mind is an information processing system, then we'll be able to solve those information processing systems in the native representation that's most convenient for silicon. And they'll be the correct grain size for the explanation, and they'll give us behavior. They'll allow us to reason about what's going on and give us the behavior that we want. So that's what I'd advocate. So how do we do that? Well, take vision, for example. We have two inputs, which are disc-shaped inputs, which happen in the eyes. They have imperfections and blind spots, and the amount of data in the disc changes across the disc. And these signals are combined in the back here, in the primary visual cortex, which is back here. And there it's processed along with other processing systems in the brain, and eventually what's produced is the qualia of a three-dimensional world from two-dimensional inputs. So here we have a diagram of the, this is from some brain anatomy of primates, and there's been 50 distinct brain regions which have been identified in the primate's primary visual cortex. And about a third of the logical connections are presented. So the brain just doesn't connect everything to everything. There's some structure there. Now, Crick and Koch make an argument that we're completely unconscious of everything that's happening in the primary visual cortex. So it's working like a reflex. And it's important to understand when we're unconscious of something and when we are conscious of it, because if we're conscious of it, there's a qualia that's present. And that's important for understanding how the brain is processing information or how it's working. It's important to appreciate that this isn't bottom-up processing. So it's not like the eye input is turned into a set of symbols, which is transformed into another set of symbols, which is transformed into another set of symbols, and then we have qualia as a 3D representation. Instead, we have a bunch of different information processing systems which are working in parallel, and they're talking to each other, and they use a number of different approaches, and the inconsistencies are ironed out, and a consistent, real three-dimensional model is constructed. So we use heuristics to reverse engineer depth perception. So remember, the eyes have got two-dimensional input, And this is an example of one of those heuristics. The dots on the right-hand side look like they're convex, and the dots on the left-hand side look like they're concave. And the concave dots look like they're a little lower than the convex dots. And you can sort of tell that the image is really a vertical flip. The left and right are vertical flips of each other. So what's happening here is there's a heuristic which is used in depth perception, which just assumes that light is coming from above in the absence of other information, because the sun is generally above us, shining down light. So that's an example of a heuristic. And perceptual psychologists have identified a number of heuristics very well. However, I suspect it's not very well understood how they combine together to reverse engineer three-dimensional depth perception. This diagram here illustrates something very neat about qualia and about perception. If you haven't seen it already, it usually takes people a while to see it. But there's a Dalmatian here. That's the head. That's the forelegs. They're the back legs. It's a Dalmatian just there. So before you see the Dalmatian, there's no qualia of the Dalmatian. And once you see the Dalmatian, the qualia of the Dalmatian arises. And once the qualia of the Dalmatian arises, you will never not see the qualia of the Dalmatian. The mind has an excellent ability to remember pictures. So if you do not see this picture for 10 years, I suspect if you see the Dalmatian now, I suspect if you do not see this picture for 10 years, you'll instantly see the Dalmatian again. So you've always been looking at the picture. It says, I was pointed out again.
Has everyone seen it, the Dalmatian?
That's the head. So when the qualia of the Dalmatian arises, concepts start to become active in the mind. So there's a doggy concept of what a Dalmatian is, and that's part of the qualia. And the mind starts building a storyline. And the way it does that is it starts making sense. So every object in our visual perceptual field has cognitive models. Has cognitive models associated with it as well as feelings. Now the feelings have to do with the significance of the object to the self, and the cognitive models have to do with our understanding of what they are. And once these objects are drawn into, once these concepts become activated, the mind starts looking over them and starting to draw inferences and interrelationships between them. So for example, Mary got an A on the test. Using empirical techniques, you can determine that human beings make two inferences. Mary is smart and this test was easy. And these inferences are made unconsciously and automatically, and there's no way to stop them from happening. And note that if one inference is true, it's less likely that the other inference is true. They could both be false or they could both be true. However, if